Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Katja Hoyer's history of East Germany changed the way I look at the late 20th century world I grew up in and put a human face on the other side of the Cold War. 80s movies portrayed it as a vast open-air prison populated by monotonous gray blurs without individuality or agency. But the GDR was not a static land that time forgot. Life went on despite increasing militarization and surveillance, and people thought they were building something together, at least in the beginning. Katja tells this story through the lives of ordinary people. She also grapples with the ongoing tension between a Germany that sees the GDR as an aberration and the desire of East Germans to hold on to their memories of a life they lived in color. Katja Hoyer is the author of Beyond the Wall, East Germany, 1949 to 1990. She's also a columnist for the Berliner Zeitung and a regular contributor to The Spectator and Unheard. We spoke about daily life in East Germany, why the Berlin Wall reduced political tensions, and why it all fell apart in 1989. One quick note before we jump in. You heard me mention on previous episodes that I have a new book out this year. I'm not going to pitch you on that again this week. Instead, I'll tell you what one of my favorite writers, Paul Theroux, said about it in a recent email. He said, "I finished A Sunny Place, and I greatly admire it. As a destination to write an affectionate Durellian tribute to, probably the worst choice on earth. As a subject for a book, absolutely great. I think whenever the subject of Malta arises, your book will be referenced. I was struck by how just about everyone in power seemed to have been involved in Daphne's murder. Your untangling the whole business was masterful and persuasive, and one ends with the impression that the entire island is cursed. Such wicked places produce rebellious, clear-sighted, singular people like Daphne, just a few pearls and all the grit, and good books like yours, because instead of fleeing, you stayed the course and wrote about it." A Sunny Place for Shady People is published by Trinity University Press in the US, and it's available in the UK and Australia, and it's also published in a new paperback edition by Mid-Sea Books in Malta. I hope you'll check it out. And now, here's my conversation with Katja Hoyer. It makes me feel old to say it, but there are probably people listening to this right now who don't remember East Germany. Could you set the stage by telling them what the GDR was in brief?
Yeah, so GDR is just short for the German Democratic Republic, which was basically East Germany. Most people in English would probably refer to it as East Germany, and it existed alongside a West German state from 1949 onwards. So two German states were founded after the Second World War, and then in 1989, the Berlin Wall, which is probably its best known sort of aspect of that state, the bit that kept the East Germans apart from the West Germans, fell in November 1989, and then a year later, East and West Germany were reunified, which basically marked the end of the East German system as the East sort of joined the West, the Federal Republic of Germany.
So you tell the history of the entire span of the GDR in your book, but you do so through the lives of ordinary people. And I found that incredibly effective. Why did you decide to take that approach?
Well, I thought because the GDR itself is such an idiosyncratic place, it's really, really hard to understand it if you haven't lived in it or experienced it kind of yourself, or maybe even people who visited it, I don't think really understood what it was like to live in it. So the only way I could see to make this sort of relatable or understandable to outsiders, if you will, mostly a Western audience, for me was to go through ordinary people, because there's then a degree of empathy or sort of a cognitive understanding of what it was like if you can imagine yourselves kind of in the shoes of a real life person that actually lived there. So by saying, in June 1954, Ingrid did this, that, and the other, it's easier to then, see why she reacted in a way to certain political changes or changes around her than me explaining it in an abstract way. So I mean, I took this kind of idea from Angela Merkel, who is arguably the most famous East German, though I'm working on it. I haven't quite reached her levels of fame yet. But basically I took this idea from her because she said in 2005, just before she became German Chancellor, that it's quote incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to explain how we lived back then. That's what she said, and then she sort of stopped talking about it for almost the entire time in office. And I found that quite remarkable, and sort of took that as a challenge and said, is it actually impossible to explain this? Or is it through the lives of ordinary people perhaps possible to make this sort of thing understandable? Yeah, that's why I took this approach.
What stood out most for me, I think, in your narrative was that this wasn't a static land that time forgot, that it was a place of immense change over the decades. I never had that impression growing up during the Cold War, Like, it surprised me to learn that the establishment of a separate East German state, and one on the Soviet model, was not part of Stalin's original plan at all.
Yeah, I think because we tend to look at things in hindsight, and imagine them basically in a certain way. So when people think of East Germany, they think of one static thing. They don't really think of it differently in the 1980s compared to, say, the 1950s. And that was one of the things I wanted to address with the book as well, which is why the story is kind of told chronologically, so that people can see how these things change. And also this hindsight thing, I think, makes it feel like something inevitable, both the fact that it existed and the fact that it collapsed again at the end. Neither of those two things, I think, were inevitable in the way that they happened. So that was something that I also wanted to look at. So particularly the 1950s, where the Soviet Union has got a very ambivalent relationship with East Germany, mainly because it wasn't part of the plan. So the idea was basically to, as is often the case when you go back further in Russian history as well, that there's this idea in Moscow that Russia is responsible for the Slavic world, and that basically includes Poland and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, but it doesn't include the Germans, which they see as a separate sort of people, if you will. And then that was the view that Stalin took as well. And also what makes it very different is, of course, this is the only nation that was an enemy to the Soviet Union, as in, it was the German army that had brought it to the brink of extinction, really, as a state, but also as a people, given that Hitler was fighting a genocidal war in the East. So that it has from the beginning got a very different relationship to East Germany compared to the rest of the Soviet bloc, basically. And one of the things that is always apparent is that because the Soviet Union needs reparations from Germany, it would rather have taken them out of the whole of Germany, especially as the most valuable parts were in the west. Sorry, the sort of Ruhr region was in the far west, and ended up basically because of German division outside of Stalin's reach, which meant that there was less to be taken out of Germany. So for all these reasons, really, the plan wasn't necessarily to have East Germany as something that they then needed to look after and needed to sort of incorporate into their world. I think, and I argue in the book, that basically it was an unwanted child, is the phrases that another historian has used for this, which wasn't what Stalin had originally intended. But obviously that goes against the grain of the idea that, that Stalin had kind of forced the split about. I mean, the Soviets do things that lead to the division of Germany. That's out of the question. But the end result wasn't supposed to be a separate East German state. That became their responsibility rather than something to just be exploited.
You said that the men chosen by Stalin to build socialism in East Germany had survived the Great Terror, not by chance, but through their abdication of morality. What did you mean by that, and what effect did this have on the new country?
So I don't think most people are aware of the fact that the people who basically founded East Germany and set up the state structures were German communists who had spent the war in the Soviet Union because they fled from Hitler's regime and then fled deliberately to the Soviet Union because they were already kind of communists and socialists and believed that this was, one, a way to fight back against Hitler, and B, to serve at this point, the only existing socialist state in the world. So they basically lived in the Soviet Union during the time of what people call the Great Purges in the 1930s. So this is Stalin basically going paranoid against both his own people and any foreigners in the country. So whilst he's purging people within his own Red Army, generals and so on, he also gets incredibly paranoid about these tens of thousands of German communists that have just arrived in this country, just as tensions are ramping up with Hitler's Germany. So he believes that most of them are probably spies and saboteurs and sort of fifth columnists for Hitler, and really cracks down hard on them. He issues the so-called German order, which basically means if you're vaguely connected to Germany in one way or another. This is also, by the way, affects the ethnic Germans that have already lived in the Soviet Union, but or in Russia basically for centuries at that point. And he basically has the vast majority of them arrested. So nearly 50,000 German communists go to the Soviet Union. 3/4 of them aren't alive one way or another anymore at the end of the Second World War, either because they're put in the Gulag system, outright shot, they disappear basically. So what I'm arguing in the book is that if you survived this, you usually survived it for a reason, because you made yourself useful to Stalin and you were able to prove to him that you're absolutely loyal to him and to nothing else. So a lot of these socialists, for example, give up their German citizenship and become Soviet citizens. They take on different names. They basically prove that they're no longer loyal to Germany or to themselves or to their families, their friends. They're loyal to Stalin only and to Soviet Russia only. And that is the point that I'm making. And then basically the residue of the hardcore, if you will, the sediment of that ideology remains, and they survive, and they then get sent back into Stalin's zone of occupation in Germany to build up structures for him.
You mentioned people, Germans living in these territories. There were also Germans left in territories that would become other parts of the Eastern Bloc. And that's another aspect of the story that we seldom read about, the expulsion of ethnic Germans from areas east of the Oder River, notably the territory that was once East Prussia. This seems like something you can't talk about here, and here in Germany, or that people don't talk about anymore.
No, it is a very sensitive issue because we're talking a lot of people, first of all. So it's basically about 12 million, 10 to 12 million ethnic Germans that once lived in Eastern Europe, and particularly along the Baltic coast in what was then East Prussia and Silesia and Pomerania, and also the Sudetenland in what is now the Czech Republic. So we're talking millions of people, and they were basically supposed to, the phrase was humanely deported from those areas, because it was deemed to be one of the reasons why the Second World War happens, is basically that ethnic tension and the claim to various pieces of land. So the solution that people found after the Second World War is to just drive all of these Germans out, and then give that land in part to Poland, and to the Soviet Union. And basically that meant that these people were obviously losing everything. They had to just leave their houses, their homes, their land behind, and were not so humanely driven into what now basically the current German borders. And that was a thing that in the GDR you weren't really able to talk about. So that was suppressed by the regime deliberately, in the hope that over the generations, basically the resentments would just quieten down over this and people wouldn't talk about it. And obviously the regime's close alliance with the Soviet Union also meant that, and the bloc in general meant that for peaceful relations with Poland and with the Soviet Union, you had to sort of have a population that accepted this. So they weren't allowed to talk about it. In the West, it did become a huge political issue. So the CDU, the Conservative Party in particular, that was like one of their core things, getting the East back effectively for people. They knew that this was never going to happen, well, certainly not anytime soon, because of German divisions, and it's even further out of reach for them, basically. But it was a big, big thing, and you had these very powerful sort of victim groups that formed and carried on talking about this. So that's why it stayed a simmering issue really into the 90s. Even when Germany reunified, that was still on the table again, and people were discussing what to do with those territories. But because it's such a sensitive issue and directly affects the relationship between Germany and Poland in particular, it's not a topic that people like talking about because it opens up a huge can of worms in terms of, what you do with those territories. Should there be any form of, even recognition that these areas were once German? And actually, the Poles are very good with that today. So a lot of the buildings have been restored, the old German buildings, and again, kind of look very German. The only area where that's completely different is Kaliningrad today, which was Königsberg, which the Soviets deliberately razed and destroyed what was left of it. And then basically built a modern Soviet city on top, which is today Kaliningrad, and there's less of an obvious remembrance of the fact that it was once a German city.
So you said that earlier that East and West started out on very different footings. You mentioned the punishing financial reparations that the Soviets imposed, and the mass stripping out of factories and resources, while the West was, on the other hand, was rebuilding and forming a sort of German-American partnership. They also started out on very different geographical terms after the separation. How did this shape the path of each of the two Germanys? And was East Germany doomed from the start because of this?
So I make quite a big point out of this in the book because I think we have a tendency to sort of view East and West Germany as two halves of Germany. So people call them, the two Germanys, or, East and West sort of implies that it's a 50-50 split. But of course, there were four occupation zones, and only one of them turns into East Germany, and the other three are merged into West Germany. So really, it's a very unbalanced divide basically between East and West. And the other thing is that the East, or the northeastern quadrant really that Stalin gets, is very rural, very agricultural, not very industrialized at all, with a few exceptions like Dresden, which was heavily bombed, of course, as a result of that. So they start off basically on the back foot in the sense that they need to start an industry from scratch. So one example of that is the town of Eisenhüttenstadt, which literally means ironworks city, where they basically found some iron ore in the soil and had to build an entire new city just for the workers that had to suddenly unearth this and basically create an iron industry that the East didn't really have beforehand.
And you've written about this recently, right, in your Substack?
Yes, absolutely, because
I'll link
such
that.
yeah, please do. It's such a fascinating place as well because it is a brand new city that they just kind of start from scratch and really, and if anybody wants to see what the world according to those socialists should have looked like one day, it's a really interesting, a real life utopia, if you will. If you go there, it's even architecturally speaking, is very interesting today still. But the point is really that they had to start from scratch, and at the same time, basically, the agreement about reparations at Potsdam, at the post-war agreement at the Potsdam Conference, was that each of the occupying powers could take reparations out of their zone. They were basically trying to avoid a Treaty of Versailles kind of scenario where they just slap a random sum on Germany as a reparation sum that could never be paid off. So the rule was basically you can take out of Germany what is actually physically there. And this meant that Stalin took that and said, fine, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So the Soviets took absolutely everything from ongoing production to ripping copper cables out of the ground, radiators out of walls. They literally took what they could. Whilst the West decided very quickly, actually, we need West Germany in the Cold War, which was beginning to very quickly emerge after the Second World War. And we needed to be strong and resilient and rebuild it, basically. So they not only did they not take or stop taking reparations very early, but they also left most of the industry there. So one classic example is when the British, with Ivan Hurst, discovered the Volkswagen factory that Hitler had kind of literally built from scratch in Wolfsburg, which was also a brand new Nazi city in this case. But they discovered that, and rather than taking it as they'd originally wanted to, taking it to Birmingham or wherever, and creating, basically incorporating it into the British car industry, Ivan Hurst loved those little Beetle cars that were still, some of them were still around in the factory so much that he decided to just leave it and restart it. And that's a classic example of the approach that the Americans and the British took, basically, in terms of allowing that industry to flourish again, which many other books have been written about. Whether that was right or wrong is a different question, since the actual people in charge of these factories benefited from it. But it did mean that West Germany basically experienced what people called an economic miracle in the 1950s. Marshall aid helped hugely as well, so they got 1.4 billion of that. As well, which is some of the highest, basically after Britain and France, one of the highest sort of payments that any of the Western European states received. That all of that helped and came together to create a miracle on the one side, and economic deprivation and a real struggle to get going in the East.
So you've said that the experiences of fascism and war meant that the average person in the East was largely disconnected from politics in those early decades. They were exhausted. They wanted nothing to do with it. They wanted stability and food on the table and a roof over their heads. Did this give a sort of free rein to the men who would become the architects of the system?
Sort of. I think it would have done as it did in the West if the economic stability had been immediately there. It's interesting that Konrad Adenauer, the first West German chancellor, actually runs the country in a pretty autocratic way. I mean, his critics at the time there's one cartoon where he's standing on a plinth where someone had knocked the Hitler statue off it, and sort of Konrad Adenauer just stands on top of it. And that's an exaggeration, but he did have a very autocratic way of running the country that today you wouldn't get away with. He did at the time because there was an economic miracle, and really most Germans just wanted stability, peace, a job, somewhere to live, and the West could provide that. The East couldn't. And so you do get basically higher and higher work ratios, so people have to work more, they get less out of it. Even what they actually get paid out, they can't really buy anything with it because there's nothing on the shelves, because they focus so much on heavy industry to start with, that in terms of consumer goods and just food and things like that, there's just not the quality there that you got in the West, and not even the sort of basics are covered. Cities don't get rebuilt because East Germany doesn't have enough building materials. So all of that comes together, and it means that people are working incredibly hard and they can't see any improvement. On the contrary, actually, things seem to get worse in 1952, 53. And that's why you get a mass uprising on the 17th of June in 1953, because people have just had enough, especially the workers for whom this is supposed to be, the sort of workers and peasants' paradise, and it isn't. And the borders are still open, so a lot of people run away to West Germany to live there. So really, they don't get away with everything to start with. There is a sense that there's a trade-off for people. Basically, they're willing to work hard and start again and relaunch their country, but at the same time, they want to see some results. And then this uprising, interestingly, because it is brutally crushed by the Soviets, and the Soviets afterwards say to the East German regime, look, we're not doing that again. Next time you're on your own, and they haven't got a sort of functioning police or a military at this point. So if this happens again, they're gone. The people would just overthrow the regime. So that then means they have to have a rethink and say, right, maybe we need to stop things like the collectivization of agriculture as aggressively as they've done it before. Allow people to have their own businesses, and so bring a degree of a market economy back in, which is what they do basically in the late 50s. And that works, and immediately you get a sort of calming down of the situation. 1958 is probably the pinnacle of that, where actually you see fewer people as well going to the West and staying, basically more people staying in East Germany, and things begin to calm down despite the fact that they live in a dictatorship. And that's basically because people want food on the table, stability, somewhere to live, and they want to see that things are moving forward. And so that's what I'm sort of arguing in the book. So long as you provide people at that point, as Germans specifically, because they're so fatigued and so tired from all of this stuff that they've just gone through, and politics in particular, given how invasive sort of Nazism was into people's private lives as well. They were very content really at this point to live with whoever's at the top, so long as it doesn't cause wars or upheaval or poverty on any scale.
You really get a clear sense of that too from the stories that you tell of individual people from this time. There's a sense that it seems like there was a sense that they were building something together, a sense of sort of a purpose and collective effort. For example, you say that East German women enjoyed greater professional and economic autonomy than their Western counterparts. So there did seem to be opportunities for people and a chance to start getting ahead once that early turbulence was past.
Yeah, and sort of once the 1953 uprising had shaken the regime, so they then invest in housing, for instance. And when you say like they were building something together, I think there was a real sense that people were participating in that progress as well. So, for example, if you helped clearing up the rubble in Dresden for years, you'd get sort of little like stamps. Basically, people would sign off the hours that you've done voluntarily to help with this after your normal work, and then you would be kind of further up the queue to then get a flat once they're rebuilt. So in a way, you've kind of contributed really to the rebuilding of Dresden, say, as an example. Or another example I found since that isn't in the book is that East Berlin wanted its own zoo because the zoo basically ended up on the western side. And that the one, so Berlin to this day has got two zoos as a result of this kind of Cold War standoff. But the eastern one was almost entirely built by volunteers. They basically just called people in these like work brigades, and they were just using their own tools, coming in and building things basically from scratch. They were given that piece of land to do it on. But it was largely a collective volunteer effort, and the regime relied a lot on that sort of thing to get things done. But it also meant that people, certainly in those early years, felt quite invested in those structures as well, because they felt it was a real sort of collective effort to get things going again. And many people wanted to start from scratch again after Nazism and the war. As well, and felt that they were sort of building something genuinely new there rather than tapping into traditions that Germany had before. They were kind of starting from scratch and starting again, and there was something quite exciting in the early years. It loses that later, the state, but in the early years there was certainly something there. A lot of the older people I spoke to, there was a genuine sort of idealism almost, because people who are still around today you can talk about that were young people at the time. And they were kind of previously in the Hitler Youth. They'd sort of lost the only world that they'd ever known. All of the things that the Nazis had told them suddenly collapsed and were not just void, but morally, tainted. And for them to get something new, to get a chance to sort of start again, was really meant something, I think, to start with for a lot of people.
So what was day-to-day life like for the average family then? I mean, if you can come up with an average family, say somebody, a factory worker or a factory supervisor or something, what would their daily life be like at this time?
But most of them lived still in very small, cramped accommodation, because it took the state quite a while to. I mean, it really got going with the prefab buildings that most people associate sort of with the sort of communist flats and blocks. They got going with that in earnest sort of in the 60s and 70s, and people really wanted to live in them as well because they were quite sizable. I lived in one of those. I grew up in one of those. They were quite spacious and clean. They had sort of central heating and all of that sort of stuff, so that most people in the 50s and early 60s didn't live in one of those, but in the remaining old buildings, of which there wasn't enough because of the war and the bombing campaigns. So that meant that most people lived in very cramped accommodation, often with the toilets still outside, and you had to sort of in the night sleep out there in your slippers and all of that sort of stuff. No running water usually. One lady that I've got in the book sort of explained how, because people didn't have fridges to start with, it took a long time as well to get sort of white good productions and those electronic devices basically into people's homes. So there was this sort of man that came around once a week with ice blocks, and you just buy them and have your sort of insulating cupboard really as a fridge, where you just put those ice blocks in, and so that you could cool your groceries and milk and stuff. One lady described how, because they just had one sink with running water kind of in the communal hallway of the house, how that became quite a social meeting space. So everyone came out there with their buckets and things to get water, to do the washing or cooking or whatever, and they all kind of met there. And she, in hindsight, sort of talked quite fondly of the community spirit there. You left your children together so that one sort of woman would look after them and the others could go to work whilst the kindergartens and sort of nurseries were being built up. So it was a very makeshift environment in the 50s and early 60s, but people did by comparison, because there was peace and increasingly basically people didn't have to worry about food and those sorts of basics really, there was still, I think, a large appreciation of the fact that people for the first time could really look to the future with the sense of, we're building something here, it's getting better. There isn't kind of a war hanging over us, or deprivation of the kind that people had known in the Weimar Republic as well. And when we're talking about working class people specifically, this is the first time that their living standards have really gone up, because the Weimar Republic was an absolute catastrophe for them, with all of its economic upheaval. And then, yes, there was brief respite in the 30s under the Nazis, which is why they get a lot of support in the mid 30s. But then, of course, they start the war that then again took the biggest toll on working class people. So for them in particular, you do get a sense that things are getting better, but still very modest conditions compared to West Germany.
So how prevalent were the Stasi really? Like how much did they impact the daily life of the average citizen? That's one thing everybody associates with the East.
Yeah, I mean, they were incredibly invasive in terms of the way that they surveyed people. Especially, it actually gets worse, progressively worse over time, because again, takes a while to build these structures up. But Erich Mielke, who's in charge of the Stasi for most of the time, still right up until the end, is incredibly paranoid and becomes increasingly so. Just as a person, he's a complete control freak. So I have one example in the book, where basically after the Berlin Wall fell and the Stasi headquarters were stormed, they found a piece of paper in one of his drawers where he'd basically outlined how he wanted his breakfast served, with a little sort of hand-drawn sketch where, exactly where the boiled egg should go and where he wants his bread roll and where the coffee should be positioned. I mean, if you have somebody like that in charge of your state security, his personality really seeped into the whole system. And this meant that, I've got one example in the book where he's talking to his own staff and he's sort of outlining East German society, and he's talking about 7 different types of people. 6 of them are hostile to the state in his view, in various degrees. And at the lowest stage, you just maybe start liking Western music and you don't think anything bad of it, you're a decent citizen. But then its spirit sort of starts corrupting you, and it's the thin end of the wedge, and you end up on a spectrum basically going up and up until you become an outright dissident. So if you take that point of view, then that means that the vast majority of people may or may not be outright dissidents, but they will be one day if you don't stop their thoughts and their actions. And then you start monitoring them accordingly. So even people who haven't done anything wrong, in the eyes of the regime, become basically a subject of the same paranoia that affects genuine dissidents or opponents of the regime. So that is quite invasive, and they do collect information on a lot of people. Most people, today you can basically apply for your Stasi file, and a lot of people have got one just because they worked in certain positions. If you're, say, a scientist, or if you're in the military, or if you're in the police, or if you're a teacher or whatever, by and large, if you were in any sort of position that was considered vital to the functioning of the regime, whether you were actually dangerous or not was almost irrelevant. You'd just be watched by the regime, as a matter of course, really. So that was incredibly invasive. But I also point out that they didn't always know, the Stasi, what to even do with all of the random information that they collected. So, people showed me their Stasi files, and it would say stuff like, so and so is a good husband. He takes out the bins and looks after the household. He doesn't drink. He likes gardening. What do you even do with this random gossip? Because it isn't really helpful, and they're just, storing it for the sake of it. So a lot of that, very quickly, the Stasi finds out that, even the amount of data that they're collating, they can't actually process all of it. So it is a bit of a mix. I mean, if you were at the receiving end of their really devious methods, when they did have people in prison, there was sleep deprivation. They would give them false information, for instance, to say that they'd arrested their children and they'd separate them from their children if they don't give them the information that they want, that sort of thing. Outright torture, outright murder. So all of that basically is also there. for most people, ordinary people that I spoke to, if you weren't sort of particularly politically active, they seem to have a really strange relationship with the Stasi. They seem to, because they grew up with it, they seem to think like that's just what it was like. You say to people, didn't it bother you that you were sort of monitored, even though you hadn't done anything? And they just went, you don't get it. And I don't get it because I grew up in a sort of free society where that isn't the case. But they just say it was just like that. You just accepted that. And the most sort of intriguing example that I found was an American guy who worked in the American embassy as a cultural attaché, and he was told all of these stories about, you got to be careful, and they'll bug your home even. And him and his wife, they'd taken this sort of magic slate, toy along to sort of write each other messages and then wipe them off. And he said it just became nonsense very quickly. We just started accepting the fact that people were listening into our conversations. But if even somebody who grew up, sort of in the most individualist, society basically in the world, arguably, comes into that context and then within months kind of just accepts the fact that every part of their life's going to be monitored, you wonder what it was like for people who grew up in that. People kind of, bizarrely accepted this.
Another interesting example of acceptance that struck me as strange too was the Berlin Wall. Like, I was a teenager in the 80s and the Cold War, and we saw the Berlin Wall as the face of this vast open air prison. Like, its name in German was a cruel irony, and we think of death strips and brutal guards machine gunning people whose only crime is wanting to leave. But it surprised me to learn that it actually reduced political tensions in the region in the beginning, and that leaders on both sides agreed with this.
Yeah, I mean that's the sort of geopolitics of it, if you will. So basically, up until 1961, when the Berlin Wall was built, and again, this is one of the big reasons why you need to look at the GDR in different time spans as a different thing. So in the 50s, if you wanted to leave, you could do. You could just basically go to East Berlin. Berlin was still an occupied city right to the end, basically administered by all four allies together. And so legally, you couldn't change anything about the status of Berlin unless all four allies agreed. And so really what it meant was that you could go to the eastern sector, which was East Berlin, just walk across into one of the western sectors because the city was open, and then take a train from West Berlin to West Germany, and you were out. Which is why so many people did that in the 1950s. And that was the reason why the East German regime had sort of lobbied very hard, the Soviets, to build some sort of wall or construction or border in Berlin, because it was losing so many people that this brain drain was really, bleeding the economy dry and society dry. So then in 1961, the Berlin Wall was built, and it also meant, first of all, it stabilized the GDR, so that suited the Soviets, because effectively the engineers and big farmers and doctors in particular, the medical sector was nearly completely gone, because West Germany also actively recruited people. I have to say that, alongside the people always imagine, the sort of leap into freedom, but a lot of it is economic. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not blaming people for wanting a better life, but a lot of this is economically motivated. So people basically leave because they get very good deals in West Germany to go to, specifically doctors and nurses, but also engineers and other people. So that basically meant that, first of all, that stopped. And by and large, because these people are sort of middle and upper class people, they're not the adventurous types who will kind of, fight their way through an armed, sort of border system. So they will just accept at this point that they have to stay in the GDR, and they stay in the GDR. So that means economically that gets stabilized basically and socially. That suits the Soviets, but it also means that there's going back and forth of spies. I mean, Berlin had, in the Cold War, it's not just a cliche, it had become a city of spies because you could just walk back and forth and nobody could stop you. And that also suited both sides, that there was kind of a stop to that, and you didn't have to constantly watch what was going on in Berlin, basically, and who was in and out of the country, where you had basically on both sides no control over who was crossing there. So that meant that when the Berlin Wall was built, there's a surprising amount of quiet after that, both from the Soviets and the East German people themselves. They don't really rebel against this. You do get an uproar in West Berlin specifically, because the West Berliners are suddenly cut off as well. People often forget that, but they live in this kind of small cut off world suddenly that is very, very precariously positioned right in the middle of East Germany. And they are led by Willy Brandt, who later becomes the West German Chancellor, but at this point is the mayor of West Berlin. And he's the only one who's really vocally outraged about this and calls the wall a wall of shame, and really sort of speaks out about this and says, "Can you come to the city?" He says, "Look on the city," in this very passionate speech, and gets really, really annoyed about the fact that neither Kennedy nor Adenauer are particularly interested, because both of them sort of quietly think, actually, that's the last hot spot of the Cold War closed up, and it stabilizes the sort of situation. Everyone knows where they are. People can't just move back and forth across the border anymore, and it suits all sides, even though people don't want to say that at this point.
Yeah, there's a sense that when you all your exits are kind of closed off, it sort of makes it easier, I suppose, to focus on making the best of things where you are, and you just have to make a life with what you've got. To the point where this a bit of trivia that I was quite surprised by, the GDR became a leading manufacturer of toys in Europe. I mean, this is not something I associate with our Cold War nemesis, toy manufacturing.
No, and they sold a lot of them to Western countries as well, including sort of Britain, the US, and elsewhere. I mean, it's worth saying that there's a long tradition of that. It's not something that the GDR specifically invented. So Sonneberg, in particular, in Thuringia, has always been a kind of, toy manufacturing place for handmade, like dolls and teddy bears, and really kind of very specialized, high quality children's toys. That was always there. So all the GDR basically had to do is carry on with that tradition. And because, it's something that isn't obviously ideologically tainted, so, they just produce the same teddy bears that had always been produced in the region. And because they are good quality, they were able to sell them. And 90% of the toy production in the GDR was for export. So this was a very good way for the GDR to create basically revenue and hard currency for itself. And it did that with lots of other things as well, so quite specialized stuff like furniture production. A lot of what we'd now call sort of outsourcing basically happened into East Germany, because people would still get the same quality labor that you'd expect from a German workforce, so very high productivity, very good sort of technical and chemical knowledge as well. And it was obviously a lot cheaper. So even, companies like IKEA, for example, they produce parts in East Germany because basically it was as cheap as doing it in Eastern Europe. But you'd get the sort of German levels of efficiency and knowledge to go with it. So that became quite a good way for the GDR to make money and for the West to save money. And so there was closer corporate, like sort of economic cooperation than people think, really. And maybe one last thing, because they increasingly got oil from the Soviet Union, and there was basically a deal made, which the Soviets later renege on during the oil crises in the 70s. But initially it works quite well, that East Germany basically had its own oil refineries. They're still in use today in Schweden and other places like that. So basically the raw oil comes in from the Soviet Union. Those refineries then make stuff out of it. So that is chemicals and things like that, but also plastic products. And they then get sold on, both used within East Germany, but also sold on to the West. So they're making quite decent money out of that as well, which is one of the reasons the Soviets eventually cut it and say, well, if you can do that, maybe we can do that too. Why should we sell you cheap oil, and so that you then make expensive things out of it and sell it on to those wicked imperialists in the West? That was sort of how the Soviets saw it. When they basically, after the oil crisis of the early 1970s and then the other one in the late 70s, basically want to do the same thing and stop that. But those are all kind of ways in which the GDR created some currency for itself.
Is Playmobil, where is that located now? That's quite a famous German toy factory. Was that built on this Eastern thing, or is that totally different?
I don't know, to be honest. No idea, to be honest, specifically.
No, I've lived in Malta for a number of years, and they had a factory of Playmobil there, and we used to see it all the time, but German owned. So the whole thing fell apart in the wall came down in 89, and the whole thing fell apart. And that's a story that everybody's heard about. And I think they should go to your book to read the details of this, but I wanted to ask you about what came later. Perhaps the greatest unfairness of German reunification. You say that the East Germans were not asked to return to something that they were once a part of, but they were expected to blend into a West German state that evolved without them for something like 41 years. They were seen as an aberration, and the West was the norm.
Yeah, I mean, that is the problem, I think, that the expectation was there from the entire world. The idea was basically that East Germans were West Germans who were just locked away behind the wall, and they all wanted out and desperately were keen to join West German society. And then that turned out very quickly not to be the case. Because, ultimately the issue is that if you take West Germany as the norm and you say that this is the normal Germany because it still exists today, there's a continuity story there. And it also took on the continuity legally. It was the continuity state also from the Nazi state, the Weimar Republic, the Kaiserreich, and so on. So basically, you have one long continuity story from 1871, when Germany was founded, to today, and that includes West Germany as part of its strand, but it doesn't include West Germany. And so the assumption that once the Berlin Wall falls, you kind of return to a status quo that was just momentarily interrupted. When you think about that, it's completely wrong. I mean, first of all, the boundaries, we talked about this earlier, the Eastern territories that were once part of Germany are no longer part of Germany. So even the very physical boundaries of Germany today aren't the boundaries that are normal, whatever that means, or that are the status quo, but they are themselves a result of the Second World War. And then the West German state and society that evolved after 1949 are also a specific result of the Second World War and the way that people built back from that. So what that means for East Germans basically means that they're not really part of this thing that was being built up in 1949 and onwards. And then when the wall falls, I think all sides begin to realize that basically they had been living in completely different states. Both of these states are results of the Second World War and have built back in different ways. And this means that you can't just merge these two societies together, or it wasn't even a merger, but expect sort of one side entirely to become like the other side out of nowhere, because people assumed that East Germans were already like this, which they weren't. They'd lived different lives. So I think that we see the legacy of that still up until today, basically, where East Germans are always predicted as the other, the strange, the different. People say they haven't arrived yet, as if they were traveling somewhere. So that's always the phrase that people use. We haven't arrived in democracy or liberal culture or whatever it may be, capitalism. All of those things were just expected basically to be normal to East Germans when they weren't. They'd never experienced them.
So what is nostalgia, and why is that seen as such a bad thing? Like, it seems like there can be nothing good about the lives people live there, that every aspect of it has to be monstrous.
Yeah, so there's this term, nostalgie, that people use, which basically means nostalgia for the East, which is often used if you say anything that doesn't have a sentence attached to it that says, "Oh, and this was a dictatorship." Everyone knows it was a dictatorship, but you can't say, I had my wedding in 1974 and I very much enjoyed it, without somebody saying, "Oh, that's nostalgie." And that's, I think, one of the problems that hinders, I think, reunification in a social and cultural sense, in the fact that you're just supposed to forget about everything that happened before 1990, or think about it in a very specific politicized way. And nostalgia is the term that people basically use to end any conversations or any nuance that you want to bring into that debate. It's sort of a label that's just slapped onto these things. I think a healthier way of doing it, and this is what I've tried to do with the book as well, is just to accept that this was a complicated story with lots of different angles to it. The fact that people sat in Stasi prisons and people were shot for trying to leave the country doesn't get any less true by the fact that other people built a lives for themselves and went on holiday and have positive memories as well. Like, both of these things exist side by side. And that's a difficult thing to accept. I can totally understand why someone who sat in a Stasi prison is angry when somebody else says, at the same time, I bought my first Trabant car and we went to Hungary on holiday in it. Because obviously the people who were the victims of the regime or were opponents of the regime see the people who made a life for themselves and compromised their basically the idea that they lived in a dictatorship became acceptable to some degree. They see the people who made other life choices in the GDR as part of the problem when they say the fact that you were on holiday in Hungary is a false memory because you may have enjoyed that, but at the same time you enjoyed it because other people were living in, at the sharp end of the dictatorship. So that conflict has never really gone away, and the people who were the victims of the regime or hated the GDR are now in charge of basically writing the history of the GDR. By and large, they are the GDR historians. They run the museums. They run the memorials. For good reason in the 90s, I think, there was a sense that you're giving them something back that they didn't have. They're now in charge of the story. But this does mean that there's always this conflict of interest over how do you talk about the GDR. And my book, as a result of it, was also very, very controversial in Germany for the same reasons, because these, as I say, historians with very particular backgrounds feel that this is their story to tell and you can't take that away from them now. And I can understand why they feel like this, but it isn't the majority of people who lived in the GDR, and that makes it difficult for those people to talk about their own memories.
It goes to some pretty strange extent too. Like I see some of the controversy right in my local grocery store, where they sell this NVA soup. You've written about this, the NVA soup. It's quite good actually. That pea soup. It's we had something when I was a kid in Canada, the Habitant pea soup, this French Canadian thing. It reminds me of this. So maybe I'm guilty also of nostalgia. And also that one with the school lunch one with the crazy looking kid on the front with tomato sauce all over his face, like sort of vampiric image. That's really disturbing. So why did that create such a storm in a tin can? Just the fact that these products exist.
Well, because they are seen as physical examples of that nostalgia. So the fact that people would choose to eat a soup or pasta with tomato sauce in the way that it was done in the GDR, the fact that people would choose to do that and sort of reminisce or wallow in the past, if you will, is seen as a way of bringing back the GDR or bringing back or falsifying GDR memory. I mean, even when they first appeared in the supermarkets, I wrote about that in the Washington Post at the time because I just thought it was so absurd. The sort of official institute or institution that looks after GDR memory, and that's in itself interesting, the fact that there's a state funded and state authorized institution that basically is responsible for GDR memory. But they got all irate about that. They said you can't just have soup with those labels on it in the supermarket. And they actually wrote a public letter to the supermarket chain, second largest supermarket chain in Germany, and said to them, you need to take this off the shelves because it's glorifying dictatorship. And I just thought that's an insane. I mean, that just sums up this entire debate. The fact that people want to eat a type of pea soup that they remember from when they were in their 20s. And just, sort of sit there and remember what it tasted like because it's part of the taste of their youth, if you will. They're not allowed to do that because they are then glorifying the system in which that soup existed. And that means that every aspect of people's lives, is sort of supposed to be tainted by the dictatorship within which it existed. And there's no acknowledgement that people sort of led different lives in that state, and that is the case. And the ultimate argument that people always say is, well, if that was the Nazi system, you wouldn't allow that. And I would actually argue that not, first of all, it's not a valid comparison in the sense that the GDR didn't have death camps, it didn't commit genocide, it didn't start the Second World War. It was a very different dictatorship. Yes, they're both dictatorships, but that doesn't make them the same. And secondly, even within Nazism, nobody said to people after 1945, you can't remember that you got married in 1936, or you can't possibly talk about, your time. Even in a Hitler Youth camp, you'd have old people talking about the fact that they sat around a bonfire and were sort of doing things that the Nazis wanted them to do. I don't see why you can't talk about that within the context of your own life experience, without somehow saying first, oh, but this happened in a dictatorship. Everyone knows that. It's just you can't take people's own life stories away from them and say that they're somehow not valid. And the soup thing brought this kind of forth in a very absurd example, I think, of exactly what's wrong with memory in Germany.
Yeah, it is completely absurd. That's like saying there's something wrong with me enjoying, Irish potato bread and remembering my grandmother or something like this. It's crazy. And I think that's what's so effective about your book. It brings these kind of people's actual memories to life at this time and puts a lot more color into it. It takes something that was seen in gray and turns it to full color. And as we come to the end here, I just wanted to ask you two more questions. So you were 4 years old when the wall came down. How much do you remember of your life in the East?
Not much, and it's certainly not a personal history of the GDR. It's more the time afterwards that made me sort of think about this. The way that your parents and your teachers and your neighbors and everyone who's kind of older than you was a product of that time, and therefore you sort of live in the human and physical remnants of something that you were born into but didn't experience yourself. So it's very much the aftertime. There's one memory which I did put in the book where basically I was in Berlin when the first on the TV tower, on the platform when the first sort of demonstrations broke out against the regime in 1989, and I remember that sort of mix of panic and excitement and uncertainty, but also exhilaration, all kind of mixed in together in the adults around me, and that stuck with me as a kid, because adults normally always know, what happens, and they know things, and as a child you just rely on the fact that they know everything, and then suddenly you sense that they don't know what's going to happen to them, and they're a bit unsure. So that that stuck with me, that sort of atmosphere of 1989, and then just the remnants of that culture that stayed. So like 90% of women, my mother worked full time and carried on working full time in the 90s. So we grew up, I think, in a very different way as children to West German kids whose mothers by and large stay at home until the kids are school age, certainly older. So that didn't change. The way that people kind of interacted with one another was still very similar. You still had sort of, the old furniture from the GDR all around you, toys and things like that. So in a way, is kind of growing up in the remnants of that made me think of the GDR, and that made me want to write this book as well.
Did you vacation on the Baltic Sea as well? Do your family go up there?
Yeah, did do that a lot. Yeah.
It's
There are
beautiful there. I really
pictures
like it there.
of little yeah, there are pictures of little Katja kind of up on the at the beach or in the mountains. And I mean, this is one thing that people forget about the GDR as well. It's very small, but it has got a really varied landscape in terms of what you could do. So you could go skiing, say, in the winter, but you could also have a beach holiday in the summer. And I think because of these kinds of things, the idea that people were somehow excluded from holidaying. There's a recent study that came out a couple of years ago now, comparing East and West German holidays, and actually the fact that more people earlier went on holidays in the East was quite a surprising fact that came out of that, because they were partially state funded, and this allowed working class people earlier to have the types of holidays that we now think of as mainstream.
I suppose you were too young to remember how the West was portrayed in the East back then, like through television and movies and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't myself, experience that, but the fact that everyone watched West German television, there were only two small areas in East Germany, and they were called the Valley of the Clueless, because those were the people who didn't have access to Western sort of TV and media. And the fact that the East German regime also tacitly accepted that. I mean, they were sometimes scheduling their own program when they knew that there was something very popular on in West German television. They'd make sure not to put their own best thing on at the same time, because people were aware of the fact that the vast majority of Germans watched that. So I think the image of the West within the GDR was actually very much shaped by those little windows that people had. So West German TV, radio, the few visits that you were allowed to your West German relatives when they got married or when someone died or whatever, you were allowed basically on occasion to travel. So those kinds of things, I think, shaped the image that people had of the West and made it a very, very idealized kind of, HD sort of version of what the reality actually looked like, because people imagined the rest of it around it, and it had to be better, of course. So, people became quite enamored with everything West. And that is an aspect, I think, also of the disillusionment that set in the 90s.
It was just the polar opposite for us. Like I was 17 when the wall came down, and so many television shows, like the MacGyver, even he would go to East Berlin to smuggle somebody out. It's a sinister place. Red Dawn, the Soviets are invading America. I mean, I lived in a small town in Canada; they weren't coming there, but we really. I remember living in fear of this. Like you were really worried that the missiles would start coming over, and it was just so many dramas, so many movies at the time in the West dealt with this. Enemy in East Germany was always, one of the main, most sinister places. So I'm fascinated by the way those differences are portrayed and how people from the other side saw us, at the same time.
Well, there was an attempt to sort of portray, especially in the news, in the East German news, to portray the West as sort of like a decadent place where there's unemployment and sort of real poverty and homelessness, which really genuinely wasn't a thing in the GDR. Homelessness and things like that. So they try to highlight the sort of social pitfalls really of a society with sort of deeper class structures. So that was a thing that people kind of thought, or were supposed to think that the West wasn't in fact universally wealthy in the way that people imagine. But yeah, some people may have a Mercedes, but there were also people who slept on the streets, kind of thing. So that's something that the East did try to highlight. But they obviously had the problem that, and this is also what makes East Germany unique compared to, say, Poland or Hungary, the fact that there is a Western version of the same state and of the same people means that you're constantly looking at your uncle Dieter from the other side, or and they tell you things as well that they do or see, or the kind of cars that they drive, the parcels that they send you. It just seemed like the land of plenty, and there wasn't much that the GDR could do to stop that image from coming over. So you had one example in the book where this American country singer Dean Reed, who was sort of sometimes known as the Red Elvis. But the fact that he was a communist, but he was an American, sort of cowboyish, white gleaming teeth, and sort of did the whole country singer sort of look at the time. But the fact that he was a communist himself and settled down, married an East German, settled in East Germany, meant that Honecker was quite happy to have his own communist cowboy and play on the whole idea of the West, in terms of like America being the idealization of that thing. And he was quite happy to have Dean Reed as a sort of, superstar there doing his whole American thing, singing American songs. But being there as a as a sort of ambassador for communism at the same time. So, they were toying with the allure of the West as much as trying to destroy it.
Okay, my last question. Is there a positive legacy of the GDR?
I think there are several, and people are beginning to now look at this. So women being one thing, the fact that they managed to get so many women into employment, that's often talked down as, it was just a work creation measure and it created problems for women because they had to still do the household and the family. But those are issues we're still grappling with today. And they were certainly better catered to in the GDR than they were later, when a lot of the kindergarten places and childcare options were basically scrapped. And childcare was pretty comprehensive as well. So that, it included sort of physical exercise, in terms of like the way that you were also physically looked after. So they, before you got into school, for example, they do sort of thorough health checks and things. If there's anything wrong with you, it would be picked up basically pretty early, and people would, deal with it basically. So, vaccinations, that kind of thing, that was all done in schools and kindergartens as well. So these sorts of things, I would say, are worth not necessarily replicating, but looking at. So how was it possible to have over 90% of women in full-time employment? I think other aspects as well. So there was more of a focus on communal life, in the sense that when they built housing, for example, new housing, they made sure that it may not have been aesthetically pleasing, and I'm not arguing to bring the exact housing blocks back, but they were, for instance, making sure that you'd have a kindergarten for every so many flats in the same like arrangement of houses, so that basically you'd have it nearby. They were making sure that when they built these things, that you had sort of facilities to go with it. That the housing block was connected to public transport, for example, those sorts of things. They were thinking much more holistically, because they could. It was the state sort of doing it much more holistically about kind of housing and living together as a community and building, because they were artificially built from scratch. So building communities, not just housing in the way that it's done now often, where you just have like an entire housing development plonked in the middle of nowhere with no facilities. So that I think is worth looking at. And I had some conversations, for instance, in Britain with Bristol Council, who are currently planning new social housing, and they're just looking at examples from all over the world, and that was just one of those. And I think there's no way that a German sort of institution would do that and would look at some of these aspects as sort of worth looking at even. I think also the way that vocational skills were really kind of valued and were part of your education. I think that was a good idea to bring sort of kids in schools. They already, even if you did your A-levels, you still had to have a technical qualification as well. And I think that obviously gives people much more practical skills to live with, but also it bridges some of the class differences between sort of white and blue collar jobs, because they were constantly merged and brought together. They had reading circles in factories and things like that to make sure that workers weren't completely cut out of sort of middle class cultural things. So they'd have poetry readings, they'd write poetry. You're a factory worker, and then after your shift, you'd sit together with your welder mates, and you'd read and write poetry for each other, those sorts of things. I mean, they may feel out of time now, but I think there are ways in which we can think about maybe making society a bit more cohesive again, and finding ways of doing that, which they thought much more carefully about, because obviously they had this idea of a classless society in the end. So a lot of the poets and writers actually came out of working class professions, through these schemes that they basically had, which again, I'm not arguing to bring that back completely, but I am just saying that there were aspects of, and this is some of the stuff that people get nostalgic about, is this sort of cohesion that was felt to be much, much more the case than this very atomized society in which we live in today.
That's a good note to end on, I think. Thank you, Katja, for taking time out of your manic schedule to speak with me today. I enjoyed the book so much. It changed the way I look at the late 20th century world that I grew up in, and it put a human face on the other side of the Cold War. So I really hope my listeners will buy and read Beyond the Wall.
So do I. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.